I've done about 200 drafts so far, and honestly, I really wish I would have done this research before any of them. We already looked at how poor offenses impact running back finishes in fantasy football. And my initial guess, my initial thought was going to be, okay, wide receivers aren't that reliant on their overall offensive production to actually produce in fantasy. I thought you were going to see seasons with like Mike Evans dominating in a horrible Buck situation, of DeAndre Hopkins dominating with the Houston Texans were absolute garbage. But actually, wide receiver is completely dictated by your NFL offense and the total points scored. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to outline the past 10 seasons. Every single year, the bottom 5 offenses in the NFL in total points scored, the wide receiver one on that NFL offense, their total finish in fantasy football, and then we are going to cross-reference that with the wide receivers that should be in the worst offenses in the NFL this season and say, okay, does their price make any sense at all? So just as an example, let's look at the most recent year. We're going to look at 2023. 2023, the worst offenses in total points scored were the Carolina Panthers, the New England Patriots, the New York Giants, the Jets, and the Steelers. If we're looking at the best wide receivers in these offenses, hell, you had some pretty talented guys. Garrett Wilson was here. George Pickens was here. However, the best finish you had was wide receiver 31. George Pickens was wide receiver 33. Garrett Wilson was wide receiver 40. We go to 2022. You have the Broncos, Texans, Colts, Jets, Titans. You have Jerry Jeudy, Brandon Cooks, Michael Pittman, Garrett Wilson, some pretty talented wide receivers. Yet the highest finish you have is wide receiver 20 with Jerry Jeudy. You go over to 2021. We have Marvin Jones, Sterling Shepard, Brandon Cooks, DJ Moore, Elijah Moore. Obviously, DJ Moore, very talented wide receiver. Highest finish you have here is wide receiver 23. We go to 2020. You have Jamison Crowder, Sterling Shepard, DJ Chark, Tyler Boyd, Tim Patrick. The highest finish you have is wide receiver 21. We go to 2019. You have Terry McLaurin, Jamison Crowder, Tyler Boyd, Allen Robinson, Cortland Sutton. Bravo, Allen Robinson. Allen Robinson, wide receiver 13 in a horrendous Chicago Bears situation with Mitchell Trubisky. He was one of the few guys to actually get it done. 2018, we had Larry Fitzgerald, Dede Westbrook, Zay Jones, Jamison Crowder, Jordy Nelson. Best finish here was wide receiver 38. 2017, Corey Coleman, Sterling Shepard, T.Y. Hilton, Kendall Wright, Jarvis Landry. Best finish, wide receiver 21. 2016, Kenny Britt, Terrell Pryor, Quincy Enunwa, Cameron Meredith, DeAndre Hopkins. Yes, DeAndre Hopkins in his prime when the Houston Texans were a bottom 5 offense. He was the wide receiver 38. Thank you, Brock Osweiler. But here anyway, the best finish you had was wide receiver 24 from a former quarterback in Terrell Pryor. 2015, we had Anquan Bolden, Dez Bryant, Travis Benjamin, Tavon Austin, Kendall Wright. The best finish, wide receiver 31. And in 2014, you had Allen Robinson, James Jones, Kendall Wright, Mike Evans, Eric Decker. Somehow Mike Evans got it done as a rookie, wide receiver 12. But if we take a step back and if we look at the cumulative numbers that you have of these 50 teams over the past 10 years, of these 50 top wide receivers in their respective offenses, how many of them were able to be wide receiver 3s or better? Just top 36 options in fantasy. You had 26 of them. That's 52%. It's about a 50-50 shot if you get the wide receiver 1 from a bottom 5 offense in the NFL that they're just a top 36 option in fantasy. But it gets much worse. If we're going to look at the amount of guys that were top 24 names at the wide receiver position, you had 8. 16% of the time. If you're looking at top 12, we are just looking for wide receiver 1s. You had 2 finishes over the past 10 years from these 50 teams. And what's crazy is, if you just look at the top 9, no wide receiver has ever finished as the wide receiver 9, or at least over the past 10 seasons. And never say never. Maybe in 1960 it happened. I don't freaking know. But at least over the past 10 years, if you're in a bottom 5 offense in the NFL in total points scored, that offense never produced a top 9 wide receiver in fantasy football and points per game in a half PPR format. So if you were looking at this, it is surprising to see that wide receiver production is impacted way more by the overall offensive play than what you have at running back. And so if we want to cross-reference this with the wide receivers that are in bad offenses this year, of course, it's very difficult to know right this second of, okay, this will be the worst offense in the NFL. This will be the second worst. These are the bottom 5 teams. So the best that we can do at the moment is we can look at Las Vegas sportsbooks. They put out lines for every single NFL game this season. You can look at the over-under, you can look at the spread, you can combine those to look at an implied team total, and then you can add up all the implied team totals for a team throughout their entire season, and you can see what Las Vegas sportsbooks are projecting from the best and worst offenses in the NFL. So they are projecting the best offenses in the NFL to be the Niners, the Lions, the Chiefs, the Dolphins, the Bills. They're projecting the worst offenses in the NFL to be the Patriots, the Broncos, the Panthers, the Giants, and the Titans. So we're going to look at those 5 offenses. Starting off with New England. I can't sit here and say, okay, based off this data, you're not allowed to draft any New England. Because the thing about the New England Patriots receivers is they're extremely cheap. Jalen Polk being drafted as the wide receiver 1 here, he's wide receiver 66. So yeah, we know that you have a shot to be a top 36 wide receiver here, even in a bottom 5 offense. So with Jalen Polk, I'm not going to tell you, oh yeah, I can't draft him as your wide receiver 7 because he can only be a wide receiver 3. Hell, you draft him as a wide receiver 7 on Underdog. If he turns out to be a wide receiver 3, phenomenal pick. You're printing money. Super happy for you. Same thing with Demario Douglas. We dive into Douglas a little bit deeper. I mean, it wasn't necessarily a prospect that I really liked, but as a rookie, he does go out there, and while he doesn't score a touchdown, he at least has 561 receiving yards and sees a considerable amount of volume. I mean, he is at about 3.5 receptions per game and a 46 intended air yards per game. But what's most interesting, 1.8 yards per route run, which is actually a pretty good mark for a rookie. And if you look at what you have over on Underdog for the projected pick'em that Demario Douglas is currently sitting at, they have him for higher, lower, 3 receiving touchdowns and about 550 receiving yards. So which actually is interesting is the projected pick'em is lower for Demario Douglas this next season than what he did as a rookie. Now, I'm not super excited to go take the higher there, but if you are, or if you want to actually go and draft Demario Douglas, right now he's an ADP of wide receiver 71 in Underdog drafts. Y'all know I'm drafting every single day on Underdog Fantasy. By far and away my favorite place to draft. I draft there every single day, year round pretty much. I mean, I've drafted hundreds of teams. It's best ball, so there's no time commitment during the year. It's how I won $150,000 on Underdog. And yeah, if you use code FLOCK when you sign up, you're going to get my 2024 fantasy football rankings. You'd get hooked up with my 2024 fantasy football draft guide. And if you use code FLOCK, you're going to get a 50% deposit match up to $250 on a new account. And Underdog is available in pretty much every state. You can see the map here. But let's move over to the next offense. Here, going over to Denver, it's a very similar story, right? Can I come out here and say, oh no, with this data, you can't draft Courtland Sutton? No, Courtland Sutton's being drafted as the wide receiver 49 right now. I mean, the expectations are very low for the Broncos. Maybe they are better than people are expecting this next season. And the thing is, in a best ball draft, if you draft Courtland Sutton wide receiver 49 and he turns out to be the wide receiver 30, great pick. It's actually going to make a difference for your roster. Now, let's also take a step backwards and let's throw the New England guys into this as well. I should have talked about this with them. Let's take a step out of the best ball world and take a step into the world where, hey, Mason, I'm not drafting on Underdog. I'm drafting in my ESPN league, in my Yahoo league. I'm just drafting with my college buddies. We're starting 2 wide receivers and a flex. There, does it ever make sense for you to take a New England Patriot wide receiver? Does it ever make sense for you to take Courtland Sutton? No. If you look at this data and you look at that severely capped ceiling that player has, if you're in your ESPN league with your college buddies and you draft Courtland Sutton to be the wide receiver 49, which is where he currently is at in ADP, and he turns out to be the wide receiver 33, it doesn't matter. You can find that wide receiver production off the waiver wire anyway in that kind of league. So if you're in a shallow, casual, or redraft format, these guys in the horrendous offenses, they don't even make sense to draft. I mean, if I could get Sutton maybe in like the last round and we're just gambling that Bo Nix is, I don't want to say CJ Stroud, but he's good enough to turn this from a bottom 5 projected offense to instead an average to slightly above average NFL offense. And then that's how you unlock the Courtland Sutton upside. Maybe you take him there, but I'm very, very hesitant if you were specifically looking at super shallow redraft leagues to take any of these guys with cap ceilings. I mean, if we're going to go through and look at what Courtland Sutton did this past season and what it historically come to at that age, you had guys like Miles Austin, Mike Wallace, Antonio Freeman, Jarvis Landry, Des Bryant, Deion Branch, Marvin Jones Jr., Keyshawn Johnson. And looking at the following points per game from a full PPR perspective, You have anywhere from about 4.5 fantasy points per game with Miles Austin up to about 15.9 fantasy points per game with Keyshawn Johnson, with a median projection of about 11.5 fantasy points per contest, which if you get him at that price on Underdog and he turns out to be that, that's great. However, in your ESPN league, it just simply does not matter. His Underdog projected pick'em at the moment is about 800 receiving yards on the season. Now, I guess if we're pointing out Troy Franklin, Marvin Mims, I just want to say for your regular ESPN draft, don't even bother. In Underdog, if you want to draft Troy Franklin at wide receiver 76 because you think he can give you a couple random spike weeks and you think he can instead finish out as a wide receiver 4 this season, go for it. But he just doesn't have the upside to be this year's Puka because this Denver Broncos offense should not be good enough. Now, going over to Carolina, I do want to reiterate, I've drafted some of these Panthers and it does not feel good. And with this data, with this video, I will tell you right now, I'm done drafting Deontay Johnson. Yes, I was drafting Deontay at a little bit of a later ADP a couple months ago on Underdog. Now Deontay Johnson has been steamed up to wide receiver 44. He's going directly ahead of guys like Christian Watson, Keon Coleman. He's going ahead of David Montgomery, Alvin Kamara, Evan Ingram. And if we're looking at the cap ceiling based off this offense, it just doesn't make sense to go through and take him over David Montgomery. Where, I mean, if Jahmyr Gibbs were to go down, David Montgomery is immediately a top 5 running back in fantasy. And like we said, David Montgomery is currently on the Detroit Lions, who project out to score the second most points in the NFL this season. If you look at Deontay Johnson's Underdog pick'em, he's at higher, lower 4.5 receiving touchdowns, just because there aren't going to be many touchdowns scored in this offense. And in 2024, he's going to be 28 years old. And if you look at wide receivers that have similar age 27 seasons to Deontay Johnson through history, you had Alan Lazard, Areche Caldwell, Jermaine Kearse, Jericho Cottrey, Marquise Coleman, Steve Breston, Deion Branch, Michael Crabtree. You have an expected median output the following year at 28 of about 8 points per contest. You've seen Deontay Johnson essentially get worse for 3 straight seasons now. Now, of course, it was a very bad offense last year in Pittsburgh. They were bottom 5 in the NFL. Deontay Johnson didn't really have a shot to produce then. But the thing is, he didn't leave Pittsburgh to all of a sudden go to the Chargers. He left one very bad offense to arguably an even worse offense in Carolina. Now, with that being said, going over and looking at the other wide receivers, such as Xavier Legette, such as Adam Thielen here in Carolina, it's still, I'm going to remain the same. If you're in your ESPN redraft league, don't even bother. They don't have the upside to make a difference for you. However, there's enough upside for Legette where I think you can go ahead, pull the trigger. And if he hits his top end range of outcomes, it actually makes a noticeable difference in best ball drafts for you on Underdog. Because Xavier Legette on Underdog currently is going as the wide receiver 65. I think since we actually took the screenshot, Jalen Polk has jumped him in ADP. Polk has been a big time riser. So I think Legette's going as wide receiver 6. It doesn't matter. He's going as wide receiver 6. And if Legette goes out there and he actually produces to the upside, turns out to be a wide receiver 3 in fantasy this season, that makes a fundamental difference. So I think there is a pretty big difference between drafting Xavier Legette at wide receiver 65 in Underdog drafts. Going, yeah, we're not expecting much at the beginning of the season, but maybe Carolina surprises us and is better than we expect. Or maybe Legette just as a wide receiver 3, which is what this historical data says typically your ceiling is in an offense like this, and you have room for upside there. Whereas, I mean, if you're going to go through and draft Deontay Johnson at like wide receiver 40, and he turns out to be the wide receiver 32, it just doesn't really matter. Now, if we're looking at the projected pick'ems that you have at the moment, what is very interesting is Adam Thielen has a price so low in Underdog drafts that he's pretty much free. I have drafted a lot of Adam Thielen. I feel disgusted by it. But then you go out and you look at his Underdog projected pick'em, and he's at 550 receiving yards. His pick'em is significantly higher than any other wide receiver that's going as like a wide receiver 7 right now on Underdog. So especially on a team where I'm like light on receiver, I'm okay taking Adam Thielen and going, okay, I hope we get maybe 1 to 2 weeks where he has 80 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown. Now, honestly, this entire video is being recorded for this one guy. I know we said last week on the live stream that we were going to get y'all Malik Neighbors video. This is the Neighbors video, okay? Because I'm not going to sit here and say, oh yeah, this video was phenomenal. I showed some really strong data that says if you're in a bad offense, pretty much have no ceiling in fantasy at the wide receiver position. So Cortland Sutton at wide receiver 50 is bad. No, of course. Like I said, those guys being drafted wide receiver 50, wide receiver 60, it's already priced in that they're in a very bad offense. And specifically in basketball drafts, you draft them there, they have some move to go up. Now, we look at Malik Neighbors on the other hand. This is a wide receiver that specifically in underdog best ball drafts at the moment is going as the wide receiver 19. Now, a couple different things. One, I want to be on record saying that Malik Neighbors is an elite level prospect. In the majority of draft classes over the past 10 seasons, Malik Neighbors would have been the wide receiver 1 in said draft class, and it's not his fault that he was in the same class as Marvin Harrison. So one, Neighbors, I believe to be an elite talent, breaks out early on at LSU. Obviously, LSU, a ton of talent. You have another wide receiver, Brian Thomas, that goes round 1 of the NFL draft. Malik Neighbors goes top 10 in the NFL draft. He goes to a team that has absolutely no target competition whatsoever. Would not surprise me if Malik Neighbors sees a 20% team target share as a rookie, which is almost unheard of. So I want to get that out there. Trust me, I understand. Neighbors is a great player. He is on an offense that has very little target competition at all. And that's the first thing that people are going to scream at me in the comment section. Go, no, Mason, you don't understand the situation. You're just looking at numbers. No, I get the situation. Going back to the data that we showed previously, yeah, we saw DeAndre Hopkins in a very bad offense with no target competition be the wide receiver 38. We've seen elite level wide receivers time and time again be put in these bottom 5 offenses in the NFL and don't have the upside to really be anything more than a low-end wide receiver 2 in fantasy, which would be completely fine depending on where you draft Malik Neighbors. Like going over and looking at where Neighbors currently is going, like in regular redraft leagues, like if we just pull up ESPN ADP right now, Malik Neighbors there is pick 65. Malik Neighbors is going as the wide receiver 25. So there, go right ahead. If you want to take Malik Neighbors in round 6 and say, yeah, Mason, I get it. It's probably a bad offense, but maybe the Giants are better than people are expecting. Maybe Daniel Jones is healthy. He takes a step forward this next season. Maybe people are too low here. Maybe the Giants aren't a bottom 5 offense. Maybe they're an average offense in the NFL this year. And we know that Neighbors can go out there. He can dominate the target share. He's a great player. I think he can be a high-end wide receiver too. I applaud you. Go take him in round 6 in your regular redraft league. The issue is when we're looking at these underdog contests and currently the price that he has. Malik Neighbors is currently going at the 2-3 turn. Now, I know it doesn't seem that crazy to take a rookie wide receiver here because Harrison's going round 1. But if you look at the historical data, rookie wide receivers are never this expensive. Unless your name's Amari Cooper, you're never going in this range of redraft leagues immediately. Which I don't want to hammer in on the fact that he's a rookie. Obviously, it doesn't matter too much. But going back to the historical data, if we are just looking at the raw numbers behind this, if you're in a bottom 5 offense in the NFL, 16% of the time, one of those wide receivers, the wide receiver 1 in that offense, can go out there and he can be a top 24 guy in fantasy. 16% of the time. 4% of the time, he can be a top 12 option. So Malik Neighbors going as wide receiver 19 at the 2-3 turn, he is priced pretty damn close to his ceiling. The only justification in my mind for drafting Malik Neighbors at the end of the 2nd round or the beginning of the 3rd round with the current Las Vegas projections for the New York Giants and their overall total points scored this next season, not to mention the historical cost of drafting these rookie receivers, is if you think the Giants and Daniel Jones will surprise to the upside. If you think the Giants will be an average offense this season, go right ahead. Sure, draft them at 19. Personally, I think it just makes so much more sense to go through and take someone here like Kyren Williams. And I don't think we have to take the risk because 1, you'd have to hit on the Giants being better than people expect. 2, you'd have to hit on Malik Neighbors coming through and not being another Quentin Johnston, which I don't expect him to be. But obviously with these rookies, there's a wide range of outcomes. We kind of understand the talent profile that DJ Moore has because we've seen it over a large sample at the NFL level. We have not seen it with Malik Neighbors. So you have a wide range of outcomes with a potentially cap ceiling, specifically because of the offense he plays in. That's an okay draft pick in round 6 in your regular redraft league. That's not an okay pick at the 2-3 turn. Now, if you are going to look at Malik Neighbors and his underdog pick'em at the moment, 5.5 receiving touchdowns, 900.5 receiving yards. If you think Malik Neighbors is going to be that damn good, I wouldn't say take him in round 2 of your draft. I would say instead, go take the higher than 5.5 receiving touchdowns on Underdog. Now, going over looking at Wan'Dale Robinson, he's going as wide receiver 75. Not worth a pick in your regular ESPN draft. Not enough upside for you to justify the roster spot. But specifically in best ball, this is another way you can play the Giants offense. Oh, wide open depth chart, as we already discussed. And if you draft Wan'Dale, wide receiver 75, turns out to be the wide receiver 40. Great pick, profitable pick. And yeah, I mean, these super cheap guys, I'm not going to fault you at all for going through and taking them. I will say, if we look at the projections out for this next season for Wan'Dale, guys that had similar age 22 years as him, you had Jamison Crowder, Mike Thomas, not Michael Thomas, Mike Thomas, Romeo Doubs, Titus Young, Marquez Callaway, Tavon Austin, Tyler Boyd, Marlon Brown, Ace Sanders. If you were looking at the expected points per game the following year, you're at about 9.5 points per game for this Wan'Dale profile. And his Underdog pick him right now is about 525.5 receiving yards. Now let's go over to the Titans. The Titans are the last team on this list. Currently, you have Calvin Ridley at wide receiver 35 in drafts. If you look at Ridley at 29 years old and who he historically comps to, you have AJ Green, Bill Schroeder, Pierre Garçon, Santana Moss, Doug Baldwin, Mushin Muhammad, Chris Chambers, Alshon Jeffrey, Calvin Ridley, and then Des Bryant. The expected points per game the following season is about 11.5 points per contest. But I would make the argument Calvin Ridley is going to a worse situation this year than what he was in a year ago. Now, I am very much rooting for Will Levis. Will Levis was extremely nice to me at the NFL draft last year, way nicer than he ever had to be. I'm very grateful, and I'm hoping that Will Levis comes out here and absolutely crushes. But the current projections are for this Tennessee Titans offense to be a bottom 5 offense in the NFL. We go back to where he was a year ago. He was with Trevor Lawrence. We go ahead and we look at DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins, wide receiver 41, currently in drafts. If you go through and look at what Hopkins did last year, what's very interesting is the splits with and without Will Levis. DeAndre Hopkins was actually much better in games that Will Levis played in, but the issue is now you add Calvin Ridley to this offense, you add Tyler Boyd to this offense, so the target competition is most likely going to go up, even if they decide to throw the ball a little bit more with the changing coaching staff as well as no Derrick Henry. If you do look at the current projections that you have on Underdog, you have Hopkins at 4.5 receiving touchdowns, higher, lower. You have him at 875.5 receiving yards, higher, lower, which is similar to Ridley. But to be honest with you, this price point, I think you're fine to draft Hopkins. I think you're fine to draft Ridley. Personally, myself, I'm not going out of my way to target them. Really, the main takeaway I want to have with this video is it's probably not a good idea to draft Malik Neighbors at the 2-3 turn unless you think the Giants surprise in a big-time way to the upside. Now, I think that's all I have for you. Really appreciate you. Really hope you have a great day. And yeah, of course, I'll be streaming every single night. So if you want to hop in a draft with me, or if you want to go check out any of those season-long pick'ems, it's all on Underdog Fantasy. That link's in the description and the comment section. If you use code FLOCK, you get hooked up with my 2024 Fantasy Football Draft Guide, my 2024 Fantasy Football Rankings, and a 50% deposit bonus up to $250. But thank you again. Really do appreciate you. And really hope we get to see you out with the live stream later tonight.